II veteran. We are going to conduct an interview this morning. It's about 10:16 in the morning, 10:16 a.m. We're going to conduct an interview about Mr. Hobler's experiences in the Army, particularly World War II, but we'll probably get on to discuss Korea just a little bit as well. So Mr. Hobler, thank you so much for agreeing to discuss with me on behalf of the University of Tennessee your experiences in the Army. And I just want to let you know that we are taping this interview, and I presume that's okay with you? Okay,
I agree.
Fine. So I'd just like to begin with, again, it's a very unstructured interview. Feel free to interject most anything anytime you want to. I have a kind of a rough outline we'll follow, but again, it's very unstructured, so feel free to make whatever comments you like. And I guess we might start about when did you join the service, and how did you come to join the service? I mean, what motivated you?
Well, I joined the service. I was sworn in on the 14th of November of 1940, and the motivation for it was that there was a feeling that we were getting close to joining the war, and there were a lot of young men enlisting, going in the Navy and in the Army and in the Marine Corps, and so I chose the Army, and
you just wanted to be part of it? Is that?
Yeah, I guess just be part of it.
Okay.
I graduated from high school, and of course I'd gone through the Depression, and there was no money in the family to go on to college, and no one in our family had ever gone to college.
Well, where were you living? Where were you?
In Mount Vernon, Ohio.
Oh, Mount Vernon, Ohio. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd lived there all my life. I was born there, and so it seemed to be the thing that the young men were doing.
Okay, and so you were a volunteer in the strictest sense. You were a volunteer. Were they drafting people in?
No, they didn't start drafting. Well, the draft had passed, but they didn't start drafting until, I know in our outfit, I was over at Columbus, Ohio. I eventually ended up at Fort Hays, Ohio, and the draftees there didn't start coming in until the first part of 41.
Okay.
But I think they started drafting around December of 40.
Is there any particular reason why you chose the Army? Can you think of any reason why, rather than the Navy or Marines or whatever?
Well, this is a little personal, but I wanted to go in the Navy, and I had a varicocele. That's a varicose veins in your scrotum. And so I went over to Columbus, Ohio in August of 40 and was operated on. And then when I went back, the recruiting officer, who was a chief warrant officer, or not a chief,
yes,
he looked at me and he didn't believe I had the operation, although I had it out there at Ohio State on High Avenue. And so I was really disappointed. And of course, being young and not sophisticated, I didn't know what to do, you know. And so I just went down to the Army and joined up. And I think that's the way I was supposed to go.
Oh, you think so?
I think so. I'm a great believer in that.
You were sort of fated that way.
I believe your life is planned for you.
Oh, well, that's interesting. So, do you remember anything in particular about leaving home? You obviously left home. You were sworn in, and then did you immediately go off to basic training, or?
No. I went over to Columbus, Ohio, and I went down to the post office and took a written test, and then the sergeant gave me a bus ticket. I went on the Mount Street bus, here I remember all this, out to Fort Hays, and there I was.
That's in Columbus.
Yeah, in Columbus, out at on Cleveland Avenue, and the post's been there since Civil War, and so we went to it was a large building that had been where they used to ride horses for exercise, but they of course modernized it, put a floor in there, and we lived in the back part of it, and then the front part was the where you were examined and sworn in, and so there were just hundreds of people there, and so you were past your physical, and when I told the doctor there about what happened, he even knew the doctor that operated on me out at Ohio State. And so, well, anyhow, I was sworn in there, and then I was interviewed, and I'd always been interested also in medicine, and so I thought, well, I'll choose the medical corps, and so they sent me over to the station hospital there at Fort Hays, and I was there until July of '41 when I left to go to Newfoundland, off the coast of Canada.
So you were at Fort Hays from like November of 40 to July of 41.
Right.
So, and you did all your training right there.
Yes, but we didn't have basic training as such like they did later on. For a period of time, several months, we went to, we'd train right in the area with sergeants, do some drill and go to class, first aid, and all the things they teach you. Of course, there were no weapons involved, and then you went on in the afternoon. You worked at your job.
I see. So for that several months, and you were relatively close to home then.
Oh yeah.
So did you get home fairly often, or?
Well, after you were there a period of time, you could get a 3-month pass. Oh, excuse me, 3 week.
3-day pass. Yeah.
3-day pass. I'll get my mouth in gear here pretty soon. I was supposed to go home at. I was homesick, man. Tears had flowed down.
It was hard. I was going to ask you about leaving home. That was kind of difficult, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't so difficult leaving home because I was going by bus, and I knew I was going over to Columbus, but it was after being there in the barracks and away that we didn't have a telephone at home. People didn't have phones in the 30s, couldn't afford them. If you wanted to have a phone, you relied on a neighbor who had a phone. And so I was pretty homesick, and I was supposed to have a 3-day pass at Christmas time of 40. And one day Sergeant Pickett, an 18-year-old soldier, and boy, I mean, he was a soldier all the way, but he was really a fair person. He called us down to the office, and there was 4 of us came in the unit at the same time, and one of them was from West Virginia. He had red hair. I always remembered his red hair. And he took off, went AWOL. And he came back, and so Pickett called us in and told us what was going on. He said, since this guy did this, he said, you can't have a 3-day pass. And
that guy about to get killed, huh?
Well, I think, I know.
The guy from West Virginia.
Yeah, I think maybe that was Pickett's idea, but I didn't get involved in things like
Pickett,
that.
You say he was 18 years old. He'd been in the Army 18 years.
Yeah,
he was an experienced NCO.
Oh, yeah, he was a first sergeant. Soldier all the way, you know. But anyhow, I did get a 3-day pass in January.
So you didn't get home for Christmas Eve?
No.
Could people come visit you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They could drive down from Mount Vernon or come down from...
Well, we'd sold a car. We had a 1928 Whippet put out by the Willys people, I believe, and Mom sold it in 37. So if we wanted to go anywhere, we relied on a relative to drive us or a friend of mine he passed away. I knew him since I was 3 years old, and he passed away last year with heart problems. And he was probably one of my closest friends. But you relied on people like that.
So you were what, like, you were trying 20 years old then?
I was 20, yeah.
Okay. Was anybody else in your family at that time also in the service? Did you?
I had a younger brother. He now lives in Panama City. He's retired from the Air Force as a tech sergeant. He didn't go in until 42 because he was younger. He's 3 years younger than I was. And I had an older sister. My dad was in a mental institution there in Columbus, Ohio, and he was a steel worker, and he got hurt real bad on the job, and he couldn't work anymore after that, and so he finally lost his mind and spent from 33 to he passed away in 57 at mental institution there. So when Mom had come over to see him, why she'd you went down Cleveland Avenue right alongside the post, so she'd drop off and see me.
So you said in July 41 you went to
Right.
Labrador, did you say?
No, Newfoundland.
Newfoundland.
Yeah.
Newfoundland.
Went by, well, it was in the mess hall in the first part of, maybe the last of June. I got a 3-day pass before I left,
Uh-huh.
and those passes were real important.
Yeah.
It was a Saturday, I remembered, and we were in the mess hall, and Sergeant Pickett and Captain, he was a medical administrator, but he was an old-time soldier too, and about 6'4". They came walking down through the mess hall, and at that time we had just been given a pint of vanilla ice cream, and we had it in a white bowl with cereal bowls, and I was eating it at the end of the meal, and they came down there, and there was a guy across from me, John Zucchero from West Virginia, and he approached us about going to, so we didn't have MOS at that time, and although I was a medical technician, he wanted me to go as a typist because he knew I could type, and so I went as a typist, and John worked up in the lab. He went as a lab technician.
You say when you say you didn't have an MOS, you literally did not have an official job in the Army? I mean,
Oh yeah,
you
we
just
had a
sort of-
job, but it wasn't designated, as far as I can remember, by number, like we
Okay.
used to have later on, like 1542s, and
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
so went on leave, went home, and that was kind of sad because that was the first time old Hobler had ever been out of the Ohio.
You never been out of the state of Ohio?
No. And so we traveled by train to New York at the Brooklyn Army depot.
Excuse me,
And-
how long did you have, much leave did you have?
3 days.
Oh, just 3-day pass,
Yeah.
okay. So then you went to Brooklyn on the train.
Yeah, to Brooklyn,
Uh-huh.
and stayed there several days, and then,
Is this a fort,
no, it's called Brooklyn Army Embarkation Point.
okay,
It's right there on the water.
okay.
Matter of fact, I went back to that same place in 56 when we gyroed to, my outfit, 11th Airborne, went to Germany. Same building and everything. And so,
We're still in July 41.
well, we're still
You're
July
in Brooklyn,
41,
okay.
right? Okay, let's go back. And so we stayed there several days, and Zook, we called him Zucchero, and we went uptown to New York and enjoyed that, and, farm hands looking at the big buildings. And so my job there was running the China Clipper. That's, dishwasher.
China Clipper's a dishwasher,
Yeah.
okay.
And then we went by boat to St. John's, Newfoundland. And so I was there until October of 42 when I went to OCS.
So what did you do at St. John's?
Well, when we first went there...
You were a
they-
typist? I mean, did you do
No,
what you were...
well, yes, I was a typist for about 3-4 days. And it was in the supply room, and boring as it could be. And so I had been working in the outpatient clinic at Fort Hays, and so I wanted to get back into that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talked to Major Dan Barry, who was a CO, and he came by one day, and I was talking to him, and so finally he got me rotated over into the outpatient clinic, and that was the work I did until I left there and went to OCS.
I'm astonished you remember all these people's names.
Well,
I really am.
some of you'll remember.
Yeah.
Some of them stand out because of who they were.
Uh-huh. That's interesting. One thing, you went by ship, I presume?
Yeah,
From Brooklyn to St. John's?
Right, on
Okay.
the Cibonet.
That was the name of the ship?
Yeah, like the song Cibonet.
Uh-huh. What kind of ship was?
Well,
How do you remember? Excuse me, this is an aside, but how do you remember all this stuff?
Well, I've always
I could-
had for, I guess,
very good memory.
well, probably so, and names, but there's a lot I forget.
What kind of ship was this? Or
Well,
what
it
kind
was
of
a
vessel
sport
was it?
transport, and it had been, I don't know what it had been. I know that we had bunks like up on a balcony which overlooked the dining room where the officers ate. And and we were separated from them by a big curtain that they had installed. And also the ship, I always remembered that I was never a good sailor. I've been on many, many ships, but I'm never a good sailor.
You get seasick, did you?
Yeah,
That's
and
miserable, isn't it?
they had, it was like rotten potatoes. There was an odor that I don't know where it came from. And so it was only about a 3 or 4 day voyage, but later on I understood the Siboney got sunk off of North Africa in 42. Maybe involved in the invasion or something. I don't know, but we were told that. Somewhere I picked that up. But you always have to be careful about that, you know, rumors and that.
Well, how would you, to this point now, well, would you have any other experiences in Newfoundland that
Well,
were
just
noteworthy before you went off to OCS?
No, it
You
was
worked mostly in the medical field.
Yeah, it was in the medical field, the outpatient clinic, which handled sick call, and then we had to be on duty. There were 3 of us that had to be on duty 24 hours a day, about every 3rd day, and there was always people coming in with wrecks, or I know a couple guys got shot, and so you had to be. It was like an ER, I guess, today, but not like what you see on TV.
Got shot.
Yeah.
You mean accidents with military
one
firearms, or?
Yeah, one shot. We had some suicides, and one guy was shot. He was a prisoner, and I always remembered him because he had come in he had been brought in on sick call, and he was crying, and he was a prisoner of the stockade, and he wanted to be admitted to the hospital. The guys were harassing him, is what it was. Called him fairy and queer, and I don't believe the guy was, but he was just on the verge of a breakdown. And so about a day or so later, they came hauling him in the back door, and he'd been hit with a .30 caliber. And what the story was, they had fallen the prisoners out for the stockade for head count, and he just turned and started walking down the road. I think it was suicide. And they told him to halt. You know, you always have to holler halt 3 times. And so he did, and he got shot in the back. And I was at his autopsy, and
he died. He was dead.
He died, yeah.
I guess 30 caliber rounds.
Yeah. I always remember too what happened. It bounced off a rib. It cut a kidney in half and chewed off the top of his liver. I saw his autopsy, so I remember that.
Oof.
And then there was an accident, you know.
What did you wear for uniform? Did you wear whites? Or?
Yeah, whites. We were issued the old blue denims, which I never cared for because they were always so stiff, and you had to really wash them a lot and try to fade them and get them real soft. And so we were issued whites.
What was your rank then?
Well, when I went there, I was a PFC with a 6th class specialist. While I was at Fort Hays, I made 6th class. There were ratings for that, sleeve ratings.
Right.
And then I made PFC, private first class, and then I made, while I was in Newfoundland, I believe I made corporal, and then I made specialist 4th class, which was like a sergeant stripes with a T on it down below. But you never could buy those, for some reason at that time. So you were allowed to wear just sergeant stripes. But there was always a sergeant to remind you, you're just a tech sergeant, not a. He was more of a commander, see, the commander type.
NCO.
Yeah.
Okay. So you decided you wanted to become an officer.
Well, that was interesting. I went home in July. I was there a year, and then I went home in July. They had a system set up on rotation. If they had soldiers who became mentally deficient or people who were sick and had to go back to the States for treatment, you could go back on a boat. And you went along, took care of them, and then you dropped them off at the point of debarkation, then you go on leave, and then you came back. So while I did that in 42, we left in July 42 on the Dorchester. I think that's the name of it. Remember the famous ship about the 4 chaplains that went down off of Iceland? That
Yes.
was a ship.
Oh, that's the same ship?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And there were 2 ships and 1 destroyer, and we were last because we were the slowest, and so there were 3 of us living in a bunk in a cabin, and so we were in there one day, and we about a day or so out of St. John, and we heard this boom, and the ship just shook, and we said, what was that? And we always had to sleep in our clothes and always have extra socks stuck in our pockets. So if you got in the water, you could use that for warmth. And so we all piled out of the bunks at the same time in a big pile right in the floor. And we went out on deck, and what it was, the destroyers were dropping depth charges. And of course, see, that's right off the area where convoys always circled. And when they started to go to Murmansk in Russia or to England, that was their rendezvous point. They'd rendezvous there and then take off like 100 ships to go to Murmansk. And we had ships that come in all the time to St. John's Harbor. Their decks would be awash where they got hit with torpedoes. Well, anyhow, I'm getting ahead now.
Well, let me before you go on, one question. What kind of installation was this at St. John's?
Okay.
Is it basically a logistic base for war
No.
in Europe, or what kind of military operation was it that you were supporting?
No, we got to, the United States got to go there because of the destroyers that FDR gave to Britain in 1940.
Okay.
And so when we first went there, before I got there, the troops lived on the Edmund B. Alexander, which was a ship. And then they built a tent city outside St. John's, and our hospital actually was in a large estate outside that. And we lived, though, the operating rooms and all that was in the estate buildings, but we lived in old pram tents that were on.
So you lived in tents?
Yeah, lived in tents.
So
and
you
then,
were pretty serious soldiers then.
Oh yeah. And boy, when winter comes closer or faster up there than it does any place else, and so we were still in it, and we didn't move until the last part of November, and it was cold and snowy and
In 41.
in 41.
And you moved to...
Over to Fort Petrel. The engineers by that time had enough of the building started that the troops could move over there. And the other troops that were there, the main ones were the 3rd Infantry, the famous troops that are now up at Fort Myers that handle all the things that...
ceremonial stuff?
Yeah, ceremonial. And
Oh, see, I interrupted you. We were just talking
Oh,
about how
okay.
you came to go to OCS. You said you
Yeah.
came home in July of 42.
Right. Well,
back to Mount Vernon, I presume.
yeah, I went to Mount Vernon, and we had, I think it was 10-day leave. And so my sister lived about 7 miles north of there, a place called Fredericktown. So Mom and I got on the bus, and it was either going up on the bus or coming back. I looked back in the bus, and there was a guy I went to OCS with, and he was
Went in the Army with.
erase that.
Yeah.
No, I didn't go in the Army with him. I knew him in high school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And he wouldn't speak to me. Of course, I didn't make any effort because I was I was a corporal, I think, then. And he was a second John.
Uh-huh.
And but I knew him in high school, but he wouldn't speak to me. And so the irony was, about 2 years later, I met him down at Fort Benning. He was changing to the infantry also.
Oh.
But, okay, and so he wouldn't speak to me, and that kind of bothered me. And I thought, well, if he can be a second John, so can I. And so I went back and put in my papers. And I had always been interested in chemicals, because when I was in high school, I did real well in chemistry. And my teacher wanted me to go on with that. But anyhow, I went back and I put in for chemical warfare. And then I left St. John's in the first part of October and traveled about 400 and some miles over to Port Basque, which is over on the other end of Newfoundland, the island of Newfoundland, and got on the Caribou. And this ship left Port Basque and made an overnight trip to North Sydney, Nova Scotia. And so I got on that and went over there and stayed a couple days, and then we went on down to Edgewood Arsenal outside Baltimore, Maryland.
Yes.
And so when he got there, we found out that our class didn't start for 10 days, so they gave us a 10-day leave.
You went by ship to Edgewood?
No.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay. You went by land from...
By train.
From St. John's?
No. I went by land on the island of Newfoundland. I went over to Port Basque, which is about 500 miles on a narrow gauge railroad, but well run. Then I got on, at Port Basque, I got on the Caribou, and that was the name of the ship.
Okay.
And went over to North Sydney, Nova Scotia.
Okay.
And then we got by train down to Baltimore. And then we had a 10-day leave because our class didn't start until for 10 days. So I went home on leave. About a day or so after I got home, I woke up one morning. I was sleeping in a downstairs bedroom, and I saw Mom walking around in there, and she was all uptight and crying. And I said, "Well, what's the matter?" And she said, "Didn't you?" I said, "I just heard on the radio that the Caribou had been sunk by a German submarine." And so that's what happened. There's a wide expanse of water there, and the submarine came in there, and I guess it might have been watching the Caribou, and of course there were spies and knew their runs, and they hit it with a torpedo, and the captain was so angry of the ship, he tried to ram the sub, but he couldn't do it. He lost his life, and a lot of people lost their lives. A chaplain I knew, Chaplain Hansen, he lost his life, and so then I went back to OCS and
That was at Edgewood. You went
to
OCS at Edgewood.
Edgewood. It's near. It's right near Aberdeen.
Right.
And while we'd be in class, our chairs all of a sudden would jump up in the air, or the building would rattle, because Aberdeen were testing weapons. That was the ordnance, and they'd test them, and they fired them over on our peninsula, where Edgewood was. They also they made war gas there too, at Edgewood Arsenal.
So that was how long a period? The
What,
OCS.
OCS? 90 days. They always referred to you as people that, especially the ones that maybe wanted to be officers. Jealousy makes you sing.
Yeah.
They'd call you 90-day wonders.
Right.
Thing was, it was a wonder you made it 90 days. Because, I mean, you mean to tell me we've been talking an hour?
No. We haven't been talking that long. Mr. Hobler. Mr. Hobler is also taping this interview, so he's changing his tape. That's why this short interruption here.
I thought I had an hour, but it's 30 minutes on each side. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was quite an experience, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. And a lot of drill and a lot of classes, and you went in inspections and
A lot of harassment?
well, no, not too much really.
Is that right?
Yeah, people. There were senior classes ahead of you and junior classes, but everyone was so doggone busy, and that there wasn't much for that. The main thing that you had was when you left in the morning, everything had to be perfect. All the field manuals had to be so and so. Those sleeves of your uniforms, the mattresses, we always folded them back, trifold, and the blankets. Everything had to be lined up. Everything had to be clean. I went, though, 9 weeks without a gig, or what we called demerits. And by that time, they moved some of us, and they put a senior cadet on the floor of other juniors who were going through.
Yes.
And you were kind of like a ideal or whatever it was, sponsor, and you're supposed to keep an eye on them and things. And I got a gig for a log under my bed.
A log?
Yeah, a broom straw. They call it a log.
A broom straw.
Yeah.
From a broom. Huh?
Yeah, the old corn brooms. That's what we swept up with. And but I didn't get very many gigs. One reason why I always my platoon leader for most of the time, his name was Roosevelt. He was a cavalry officer. And the day where we had to be briefed by him, and so we were standing out in ranks, and I was back in the second rank and second person in the squad. And all the time he was talking, he kept looking at my shoes. And what it was, they were Garrison shoes. They stopped issuing them as soon as the war started. And, I think they started before the war started them. They stopped issuing them. But they were they came up ankle high, and they were made out, I think, of some of the finest leather. You could get the best shine that you could ever. And so there's old Hobler standing there with those highly shining shoes. And he just kept looking at them. And I think that was what kept me from getting gigs. He was impressed, and maybe when he came by my bunk, he just walked on. I don't know.
Mm.
And because the main boot, after the war started was the old combat boot, which was a rough leather and had a thing that came up high and had 2 buckles on it. And matter of fact, I knew the lieutenant later on whose dad was in the quartermaster corps. He was the inventor of that boot.
Mm.
I met him in Japan, but anyhow. But
to this point in your career, had you're a fellow from rural Ohio, and you never left Ohio until you
went in the Army.
Went in the Army.
And then went overseas, yeah.
So, did you have any impressions of people from other parts of the country? Like the guy from West Virginia, when you were at Fort Hays, he apparently made an impression. So you probably wanted to strangle him. But anyhow,
Yeah.
I mean,
He was a lot bigger than I though was. I remember that.
Did you have any experiences that you thought, man, these Southern people are a little strange, or man, these Californians, or these New Yorkers, or did you have any noteworthy interchanges with people from other parts of the country?
No, as far as being out of state, the only one I remember at that time was that redhead guy from West Virginia.
Oh.
But when they started drafting people, they also started calling in the reserves. And so we had a large influx of older men who were in the reserves. Matter of fact, a lot of them had been in the regular Army, got out, went in the reserves, and then they were called back in. So a lot of them made an impression on me.
What kind of impression have you left?
Well, some of them are what we call shack rats. They might have been married. If you were married, you were called a shack rat. Or you might be living with some woman, but you were called a shack rat. And so, like on Thanksgiving and Christmas, the Army always put on this huge feed, everything what we call soup to nuts. And I remembered one was Sergeant Gabowski, and he was a Polish guy, and we all ate family style, and there were 8 to 10 people at a table. And old Gabowski sat down there against the wall, and he had a brown paper bag. And others were doing this too. And so on the table would be bowls of nuts and oranges and apples and bananas. And to someone who came out of the Depression, this really made an impression on me. Depression made an impression on me,
Yes.
Because we were never hungry, but there wasn't always all that food. And so anyhow, they would unload those bowls of nuts in this bag and oranges and apples and send out for more. And when we were through eating, why, they took them home to their wives, see, the shack rats. and that made an impression. And but we always, and then another one was a Corporal Sullivan, who was an old-time sergeant, and I think he had about 20-some years in then, and I thought he was ancient history. I was 20, and he was probably in his 50s, but he's also alcoholic. He's a good soldier. And if you went to his foot locker, was at the foot of his bed, you had to have everything in there like on inspection day. We always kept everything just like we had to by a diagram, and the tray, and then so forth. But his foot locker was that way all the time. But one time I remember he got on a drunk, and I was in the John sitting on the stool, and he came and stood in the door, and he had a pint of whiskey. And he said, they told me I'd better sober up by tomorrow or so-and-so, or they were going to bust me or do so-and-so. I figured he'd already been busted several times. But he went on drinking. I don't know what happened to Sullivan, but he was he was a soldier, though. I always remember another thing about him. When he wore his blue jeans or denims, he would paste them on the wall of the, while they were wet, he would paste them on the wall of the barracks where there was a clear place. Smooth them out, and when they dried, they were pressed, see? And he didn't have to press them, and he saved money because, of course, at that time when I went in, you made $21 a month. And when you went through the pay line, the first sergeant was sitting right below the paymaster, who was an officer of the company, and he was there to collect. We had to pay for laundry, and also for
Soldiers and Sailors Home, didn't he?
Yeah. You always paid 10 cents for the Soldiers Home, and that was taken out prior to it, though. That was always taken out. If you were out of money, you could go to the first sergeant. He'd sell you a book of stamps or coupons, and like there would be like 5, 10, 25 increments in there. Then you could go to the PX and buy things, or go to the only other place was the movie, and which made cents, 15 cents. And so he'd collect on that. So when you got through, you might have some money. It depends on how you use the buying these coupon books. I forget, we had a name for that. I forget. For those coupon books. Mm-hmm. Wait a minute. Jawbreaker? No. Something about the jawbone. That was it.
Jawbone.
Yeah, jawbone. When you bought something like that from the first sergeant, that was jawbone. I guess it's because you had to sweet talk him into selling.
I see. Huh.
Yeah.
So you graduated in what? Like
23rd January of 1943. And we got a 10-day leave, and then I went home, and then I came back, and we all wanted to get in the mortar battalions. The 4.2 mortar. Have you ever been acquainted with that weapon?
No, sir.
It is a sweet weapon, and I saw it in action later on in Korea.
Excuse me, you were a chemical officer now?
Yeah.
You were a chemical officer?
Right, chemical officer.
Second lieutenant in the chemical corps.
Right. We went back to Edgewood Arsenal, and we all wanted to get into what you call a 4.2 chemical mortar battalion. These mortars fired war gases in the shells, but later on this weapon was the top weapon of mortars in both World War II and Korea, because it was a rifle barrel, and it fired a 25-pound shell. I forget the range. I used to know all that. But it fired 25, and mainly HE, high explosive. And when those old 4.2s landed out there, I mean, that croak, boy, I mean, that's a sound. It stirs your blood up, something like they always said, war horses, with a trumpet, get them going.
Hmm.
And
so you went back to Aberdeen,
yeah,
or back to Edgewood.
Yeah, back to Edgewood.
And you wanted to get into a...
We didn't get into it. And so, next thing you know, we had orders to go to the Air Chemical Officer School, which was 1 month there at Edgewood. So we went through there, and it was mainly classes about relating to chemical warfare around Army airplanes, which that time was called Army Air Corps. It wasn't called the Air Force.
Right.
And so we went to that, and then I got orders to go to Fort Worth, Texas. I went down there, and by train, and
Then Dias or what? Carswell? What's? You,
No, Carswell. That's in New Mexico. Carswell, New Mexico.
I'm getting mixed up.
Yeah. There was, I think, an airfield there, Carswell. There were airfields all the way down in.
Right. Remember what installation you went to at Fort?
Yeah, it
Fort
was
Worth?
the headquarters of the Western Flying Training Command. It was downtown in a hotel.
Oh, okay.
And
literally in the city of Fort Worth.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then we went by train out to Santa Ana, California, which is kind of near. I think it's north of L.A.
This is what, like now, February 43?
Yeah. No. Let me see.
Maybe March.
No, it'd be like March. We got out there in March. Yeah.
Okay, March 43.
And so we ended up there at Santa Ana at the pre-flight school. And our main job from the time I got there in, at that time, say March of 43 until October of 43, was teaching a 2 weeks course on chemical warfare to aviation cadets. This is pre-flight school. And so we would teach them. That was our main job. Then in October of 43, I was transferred to Deming, New Mexico, which is about 100 miles.
Is that right? I was just down there in
Is that
Deming,
right?
New Mexico. That's interesting. Yeah. Excuse me. Go ahead.
That's okay. Which I think was 100 miles west of
Las Cruces.
El Paso.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, El Paso.
El Paso.
And so I was there until...
what was there? Was it what?
That was a bombardier school. They taught...
At Deming, New
bombardier.
Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this was a temporary base right outside Deming, which is just a little old one-horse town. You know, you just drive around the block. I think there were a couple bars there and one theater and one restaurant.
Did you ever drop down to Columbus and see where Pancho Villa made his raid? And...
Yeah. We went down there one time, and matter of fact, there was a whack-on post who I knew. Her mother was a telephone operator when Pancho Villa made the raid across the border to Columbus.
Right.
And she laid down on the floor of the telephone office, which I guess is just a crude floor of a switchboard, and operated that because the old bullets were flying through the windows.
Wow, that's something.
Yeah. But I went down there just one time. One lieutenant had he had you couldn't get tires, you couldn't get a lot of gas. He just had a type A. I forget how many gallons you could have a month of gasoline. So we went down there mainly to get some silk stockings, which were real rare. No, wait a minute. No, was it silk stockings or nylon? It was one of those which had gone to war. You know, like during the war, Lucky Strikes always advertised their green had gone to war in their cigarette packages. Mm-hmm. And so this nylon, it might have been nylon. I guess it was nylon rye, because the women liked it because they didn't get holes in them like silk stockings did. So we went down there and got some whiskey. You could go across the border to what's the name of it?
Las Palomas.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
And got gas. You get over there without ration. Got a tank of gas and some. I got some tequila. I remember later on. That's wicked stuff. Tequila. And got some nylons, and we saw the little town of Columbus, and when it went back.
So you're at Bombardier School in Deming then, and this is for November 43?
October 43 until October of 44.
Oh, you were there in Deming the whole year?
Yeah.
Oh, boy, that's...
And I was the post-chemical officer. I was a second John. And
you were still second lieutenant?
Yeah. And so...
well, what did the post-chemical officer do?
Well, you were responsible for all the training of the enlisted men on chemical warfare. When I got there, it was a Colonel Murphy. He's a long-time old Air Force pilot. Excuse me, Army Air Corps pilot.
Uh-huh.
And he called me in his office and let me... I was second John there. There's a bird colonel who was like God. And let me know in so many terms he didn't want me to be getting in the way of training bombardiers. And so he was a nice old guy, and he says, I don't want any of those chemical warfare signs up. He says, I hate signs. He said, no one reads them anyhow. And they said they put them up. Said, no one ever reads a sign. I didn't see too many signs at Deming. Because he said...
He didn't like time.
No, he didn't like it. He was what you call a crusty person.
Did you get back to Ohio at all between, let's see,
Yeah.
from when you were out in California or
No,
when you were in Deming?
California, no.
When you were in Deming?
Yeah. In Deming, I went back and I got to leave and
Back to Ohio.
yeah. But now that's another experience of people that they ought to keep a record of is by traveling by train. I mean, if you had the money, you could probably get a Pullman. But the only time you could get a Pullman was, like I had a Pullman going from Santa Ana to Deming.
Yes.
But that was because it was on your orders. On your orders, you had transferring it. You always wanted to have first class where you could go by Pullman, and then also were, what was it? I forget the term, but you were given so much money per diem.
Per diem?
Yeah, per diem, see. And because as a second lieutenant, you made $150 a month, and you had to watch it to make it last. And you had to pay for everything. There wasn't any more free food like it was when you were a enlisted person. But anyhow, you traveled by coach, and the trains were really loaded. I mean, people would be standing in up and down the aisles. They'd be sitting on their suitcases. You went in the men's lounge, to shave or to go to John. They were sitting in there. They were standing or sitting out on the vestibules, between the cars. And sometimes people would they all had a camaraderie or whatever you call it. People that were standing would go sit down and the others would stand up. But that had to be kind of a agreement on the train.
So train travel wasn't a lot of fun.
Oh, no. I had a cousin who left Mount Vernon to go down to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Her husband was stationed down there, and she was pregnant. And she stood up all the way by train from Columbus, Ohio, to Clarksville, Tennessee. And she was.
And nobody gave her a seat. Well, that's pretty bad.
That was. Well, anyhow, let's go back.
Chivalry wasn't very much alive on that train. Huh?
One nice thing that we always enjoyed was eating on the train. I always had. Was eating in the dining car. Yeah, because they always had white tablecloths and silverware, and it was I always liked the food. I enjoyed the food, and of course you always saved money when you knew you were going on a trip, and how much it cost and so forth. So I went February, and then again I went home in September of '44.
How long did it take? Excuse me, just by train, like 2 days? Or
well, it was about a day and a half. Yeah, the longest trip was from El Paso up to Kansas City because they stopped a lot. But if you got to Kansas City, there was a special train, I forget the name of it, that went down to St. Louis. And if you got on that, it was like an express. And then the Jeffersonian went from, as far as I can remember, went from St. Louis to, I think it went into Washington. And so if you get on the Jeffersonian, you travel. And I know it stopped at Columbus, so I always tried to get on the Jeffersonian when I got to St. Louis to go to Columbus or Columbus to St. Louis.
Because you would go pretty fast.
Oh yeah, they traveled. They only stopped at a place like Indianapolis, and I think that was it. And but to tell you a little bit why I started going to being a paratrooper.
Okay, November, is it?
No.
40.
Well, we're at Deming, New Mexico.
And it's November. What month?
Well,
when did you leave Deming, New Mexico?
I left in October, but the
October
action
of
44.
44. Okay.
Yeah. But the action started back around about April of 44.
You mean to try to go to paratroopers?
Right.
Okay.
I don't know why that ever got. I don't remember now. Things like that. But I always felt like the war was passing me by, and.
Well, did you actively solicit orders to European theater?
No,
or either theater,
yeah.
Pacific.
No, you had to. I first put in. Of course, this is all by Army regulations, and it said how you could apply for being a paratrooper and what the qualifications were. Like you couldn't be under 5'4", I believe it was, and not more than 180 or 190 pounds. And so I went by regulations, wrote up my application, sent it in, and it went. It had to go out to Santa Ana, to the headquarters out there, and then to Washington, D.C. You have all these chains of command, things I had to go through, and every one of them had an endorsement on it. You might send in a 2-page application. When it came back, it might be an inch thick. And so when it came back in June, the invasion already started. But it said on there that they had all the chemical warfare officers that they needed in the airborne divisions, and if I wanted to go paratrooper, I had to
go infantry.
Go infantry, and so I said okay. So I put in the application. I waited.
Branch transfer.
Yeah, branch transfer, and then I. Waited 2 months, I believe it was, and I went on leave, and I came back, and when I came back, that was in September of 44. I went home to Mount Vernon High and then came back, and so when I came back, my orders weren't there. So I called a captain I knew out there at Santa Ana, and he says, "Oh, we've got your application here in the box on the desk." He said, "We thought you weren't serious about it." What it was, what they were doing, they knew if I left. This is Hobler's interpretation. They knew if I left, they had to send in a replacement, which they probably didn't have. So they just ignored me, see. I said, well, I wouldn't have, if I weren't serious, I wouldn't have sent that in. Well, okay, we'll send it in. So they sent it in, and in less than a month, I had my orders to go to Benning. So I went by train to
Columbus, Georgia?
Yeah, Columbus, Georgia, Fort Benning. And I went through the school there, a 2-month school, and we had to pass map reading to go airborne. And some of them didn't pass it, and so they didn't go, but I passed it. And I went, and then we, on the 10th of December, went over to the jump school, which was on the other side of Fort Benning, and that was a 4-week training and plus 1 week of jump master school. All officers had to go through jump master school. And so I graduated from that in January. It was always kind of strange. A lot of things that I did in my life in the Army was always in January. I don't know why. Like I retired in January.
Oh, all right. So this is January 45 now.
Yeah, January 45.
The war's getting close to being over here.
Yeah. And so I went over to an area called the Frying Pan area. It was a training area for paratroopers.
This is Fort Benning.
At Fort Benning.
Okay.
And it's over behind the the 250-foot towers. Have you ever been down there?
See.
These
Yes, sir.
250-foot towers? Yeah. So we went over some training in Alabama, and while I was over there, which was just across the Chattahoochee River, we got orders to go to glider school up at Camp McCall, North Carolina.
Where is that?
That's right behind, the only way I can describe it, behind Fort Bragg.
Oh,
later on, when
it's
I
near
was
Fayetteville, then.
yeah,
Where
right.
McCall was.
Yeah.
Okay.
And later on, when I was in Special Forces at Bragg, why we did training in the same area. That was years later. No. Well, go back to January 45. So we went from a lot of us went from Fort Benning up to Camp McCall. We took 1 week of glider training, and that consisted of riding in gliders and looking at the different ones and loading jeeps and vehicles in gliders. And then we were farmed out to infantry replacement centers. And the reason for it was the Battle of the Bulge, took place in December, and they lost a lot of people, and so they cleaned out all the infantry replacement centers. And we went down there and
The infantry replacement center was where?
excuse me, Fort McClellan, Alabama,
Okay, in Anniston.
near Anniston. And I was there until April.
That was after Fort McCall. Fort
Right.
McCall to Fort
Fort
McClellan.
McClellan.
Okay.
And
This is what, like February now?
yes, last of February.
Okay.
I was there about 2 months. And
What was your job there? Just basically waiting
No.
for orders to go
training,
somewhere else?
training basics. I was in a I was in a company, in a regiment. I forget the number of it, but it was. I was a lieutenant there, and let me see if I have it here. No, I don't have the name of the regiment, but it was a basic training.
So you weren't actually in like this replacement center or what
No,
do you
no,
call it?
no.
Oh, okay. That's why you went there initially, though, right?
Yeah, well, I went there initially to replace an officer who had gone to replace the people that got killed or captured in the Battle of the Bulge.
Oh, okay. And you replaced him in his training unit,
Yeah,
training
right.
regiment, or okay.
So we trained. They were just going through the regular infantry training that they had out in the field, firing ranges, drill, all kinds of weapons. And then I got my orders to go back, and so I got interesting. I was sitting in my Doramahuchi, folding my socks, and this lieutenant came up, walking up the walk, and he said, "Hey, did you hear what happened?" I said,
This is
"No."
at Fort McClellan.
Fort McClellan.
Okay.
He said, "Did you hear what happened?" He said, "President Roosevelt died." And so that's how I heard about him dying. And so then I got on the train and went from there to Atlanta to get on the transfer train. So when we pulled into Atlanta, they pulled our train over to one side because they were taking President Roosevelt north. So I stood in the door when I saw his train go by, and you could look in through the window and see his casket in the
Oh, wow, that's
in
some
the thing.
kind of interesting
Yeah.
experience, huh?
And so then I went back to Fort Benning, and I got back there. I was all hot. I thought, boy, we're going overseas, because when we got back, we heard rumors that everyone's going to ship out. There are always the rumors going around.
Excuse me, why did you leave Fort McClellan to go back to Fort Benning?
Well, they wanted us back at Benning to do whatever the airborne was going to do. I guess
Okay.
they probably had enough people coming out of OCS that would replace us at Fort McClellan. And since we were airborne, and we were still drawing that good old airborne pay, $100 a month, and so we went back to Fort Benning, and and I went over again to the 3rd Parachute Training Regiment there at what we call the Frying Pan area, which was well named because in the summertime,
That was hot, huh?
hot. And so I thought I was going overseas, and I wanted to go, and I went up to Colonel Walton, who was the regimental commander, and I said, I want to go overseas. And my buddies were shipping out and things like that. And so he said, well, I'll see what I can do. And so he came back and told me that I couldn't go until, because I had once been overseas, which was in Newfoundland. And that was overseas, and you drew overseas pay, because the Army regulations they had then was that if you'd been overseas, you stayed in the States until other people had gone. And so I was stuck. And you might think that's kind of unusual, but we had people at Benning had been there for years and years and years and years. We called them, what did we call them? Not short-timer, that's another thing. Homesteaders.
Homesteader. Oh, yeah, right. Okay.
Homesteaders.
Hey, they still called people that when I was in the Army.
They had been there so long, you know, they knew someone that kept them off orders and things like that. And so I stayed there at Benning until the war was over, and then I left there for about a month and a half, and some of us went up to Fort Riley. Well, actually, it's Camp Funston, right next door to Fort Riley in Kansas.
This is when now? Fall of 45?
October, yeah, October and part of November of 45. About a month and a half we were up there at Camp Funston, which, well, okay. You want to shut that off? I want to get the rest of it.
I'll just sure.
How much longer do you think this will? Well, this is 30. I thought I had I got a lot of hour tapes back there.
Mr. Hobler is changing his tape in his machine here now.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how much longer. Again, it depends on, I guess, both of us to some extent.
I ramble. I got to watch about
Let's
rambling.
see. We're where are we here now? We
November.
You're out at Camp Funston, Kansas.
Right, right next door to Fort Riley.
Fort Riley, right.
And the main thing I did there was just honchoing people that was like a replacement center. What they were doing, the war was over, World War II was over, and they were closing camps. And they knew that they had to bring all these millions of men back from overseas. And so they were, of course, shipping replacements over. And so what they did, they would ship them into us, and we'd give them so much more training, which mainly was to keep people busy. And then they'd send them overseas, maybe to the east, to Japan, or to the west, to Germany. And so we did that for about a month and a half, and then we got orders to go back to Fort Benning. Went back to Fort Benning, and really didn't do there. We weren't training anymore. Well, I wasn't training any troopers, and so it was mainly housekeeping and some classes that we went to, and then just before Christmas, I got orders to go to Fort Bragg, and the 82nd was coming back there. And so I got a leave, and I went home on leave for 10 days, and then went to Fort Bragg in January of 46. And so I was in a regiment there, I think it was a 327, and no, 326 Airborne Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne, right. And so then they asked for people to volunteer to go to Japan, and I thought, boy, I'm going overseas. And so I volunteered and went to Japan.
Yes, sir.
And we went by train to
from Fort Bragg.
Fort Bragg. We went down to Atlanta, and then headed through the southern part of the United States to L.A. and there north by train to Fort Ord, California.
Monterey.
Mm-hmm. And then we stayed there several days, and then we went by train up to Fort Lawton, Washington, right near Seattle.
Okay.
And then we went by boat, 14-day trip by boat to Yokohama.
You get seasick there?
Uh,
Bad, huh?
Yeah, about after 5 days I'm okay, but it's always that you're just, on the edge of it. And so
this is when now? Let me see.
this would be, I'd say February, yeah.
February 46.
2nd of February 46 to 16th February, en route to Japan on. I don't remember the ship. I think it was the Pope. I used to maintain, we were all given little cards when we got on board, told our cabin number and the name of the ship. And they're off here somewhere.
So you got to Yokohama on the 16th of January, or February,
of 46.
Yeah. And then?
Okay, while I was on board ship, it was interesting. I was one of 3 mess officers, and we fed 1,500 troops 3 meals a day. And we also had black troops on board. And, at that time there was a separation, right, of troops. Like when I was at Deming, New Mexico, they had black troops on in separate units there.
Yes.
And see, I was born in Ohio, and I went to school with black people, although we called them colored then,
Yes.
And I never had any problem with them. And so the first time I had noticed about segregation was when I was going to parachute school. I went to Atlanta by train, and then on the, central of Georgia down to Columbus. And sitting behind me in the car was a black lieutenant. And so here came the conductor taking tickets with an MP behind him, a sergeant. And so when they got to this black lieutenant, the conductor said, "You're in the wrong car." And the lieutenant started to argue. And the sergeant says, "Lieutenant, you heard him. Go on back to that car." And of course he turned and went back to the car, because as an officer he couldn't afford to argue with the MPs or getting involved in. And that really got me uptight. And then when I'd go into Columbus, Georgia, I'd see fountains that were marked white and colored,
right,
or white and colored restrooms, things like that. So to go back to February of 46, there were black troops on board, and one of the officers that was with me was a Southerner. And now this is not stretching the imagination, but one day he got so mad at the black troops. They did a lot of things, I felt at that time, to cause problems. And because they were segregated, and I guess they felt, and rightly so, the war was fought about rights. Because one day I had to take a meat cleaver away from this lieutenant. He was going to go after him. And they'd do things to aggravate you. They could come through the line and get coffee one time, and then, you had those big old GI China cups that the Navy had, and you couldn't come back, because when you're feeding all those troops, you can't have that. And I remember one day some of them tried to come back, and one of them got a cup of coffee, and I told him to drop it and go back. He wouldn't do it. I reached out and took that cup of coffee away from him. I put my hand right down in that coffee and pulled that cup away from him. It was hot. But see, we didn't have segregation in the Army until really 48. But the first one to have segregation was the airborne units. They were the first.
Desegregation.
Yeah, desegregation.
Yeah, that was Harry Truman's.
Yeah, that's right. He's the one that did that. That's right. But I never had any problems with them. And later on, in serving with them in Korea, they did fine. They were just as brave as the white people. You've always heard these rumors and stories running around.
Well, now, during the Second World War, did most of the black units have black officers?
Yeah, they had black officers, but I think most of them were white. They were white officers.
Oh, okay. There were some black officers, and a black officer would never serve with a white unit.
Not to my knowledge. I never saw them. Now, when I went through chemical warfare OCS, we had two black soldiers. One was Pitts, and the other was Thornton. I always remember them because they were really intelligent, very sharp people. And
this is in your OCS class.
Thornton was quite a speaker. I mean, he was.
Were they actually, were they segregated somehow?
No,
within the class?
No.
Oh, so there were places.
Yeah, there were.
In which there was no segregation.
That's right.
And that would be an example there.
Yeah.
In OCS.
They ate right with us, you know. They were in ranks with us. They were in the shower room. They'd be there. I mean, everywhere.
It's kind of interesting. You think conceptually that.
Yeah. But once they left there, I don't know what happened, you know.
So we're still on the ship.
Right. And so we fed the troops and 3 times a day, and it kept you busy. And I mainly lived on saltines, things like that. Saltine crackers.
Why didn't you eat regular food? It was just
that
bad.
old. No, it was good, but it's that old queasiness, you know, of the stomach.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Because of the seasickness.
Later on, I found out the best thing to do is keep your stomach filled up as much as you can.
Is that right?
Yeah. But when we got to Yokohama, we went out to Camp Zama. This was
is that right?
In February. You been there?
Yeah, I was stationed there for 3 years. Yeah, that's interesting. You went to Camp Zama.
Yeah, and then went by train north to the 11th Airborne area. We went to, Sendai is around Yokohama, Tokyo. That was 1st Cavalry Division, and then we went up to run into the 11th Airborne area of occupation was around Sendai, overnight by train, and then on up there. Of course, the 11th Airborne, their headquarters was up on Sapporo, in Hokkaido, the northern island. And so then I ended up again. I didn't go to the infantry. I ended up with the field artillery up at Hirosaki on the northern part of Honshu, the main island of Japan, with the 457 parachute field artillery. There were about 4 or 5 of us went there because they were short of officers, field artillery officers, or officers, period. And so I was there with the 457 for a couple months, and I was the S2, the battalion S2, intelligence officer. And then then they transferred some of us down to the 674 parachute field artillery, the 11th Airborne Division, at Jimachi, which was 200 or 300 miles south. And while I was there from I guess last of April of 46 until April of 47. I was the battalion motor officer
in Jimachi.
And we lived in mainly Japanese barracks. Our headquarters there had been rebuilt because it burned down. And but the buildings standing was Japanese buildings.
Could you describe your relationship with the Japanese, how you related to the Japanese people, what you thought of them, what you thought they thought of you, what your interactions were on a day-to-day basis, just some kind of outline your feelings towards them?
Well, I was...
how you interrelated with them?
Yeah. Not so much at... when I was with the 457, the only contact I had with them there was when I was at the 457, that we had some barracks, some buildings that had some Japanese food in them. Like one of them was loaded with canned crab meat. And so we had people that break in there because the Japanese people were really hungry at that time. And because, they lost all of their
most of their transport during the war, that haul food. To go back a little bit, matter of fact, I had a dog, his name was Yogi, that I picked up at Camp Zama. The reason I picked him up was there at Camp Zama were a bunch of American merchant marine, who had turned their ships over to the Japanese because Japanese didn't have any ships. And they had turned the ships over. Well, he had this dog, Yogi. And
one of the merchant marines.
yeah. And he was going home, but he didn't want to leave Yogi. And I always remember his name was Yogi Jorgensen. And I think he was a Swede. And but he was American. And so I said, well, I'll take the dog, because I've always been a dog lover. And so I took Yogi. And he had picked up Yogi in Sicily in 45, I believe, when the ship was into Sicily. He had him on board, and they went over to the Pacific, and Yogi got away from me one time, and he came back, and he had a wire around his neck. I guess some native was going to fatten him up and eat him, And but anyhow, this was the story he told.
So you had Yogi.
Yeah, I had Yogi.
And you took Yogi with you from
took
Camp
Yogi.
Zama up to northern Honshu and
Right.
then back to, was it
Down to
Jamachi?
Jamachi.
And he's still with you, is he? Yogi?
Well, no. While I was there you talk about relationship with Japanese and Americans, Yogi hated the Japs.
Oh, is that right?
And every morning in the motor pool, he gave them holy hell. They walked through the motor pool, here's old Yogi right on their heels, He wouldn't bite them, but he let them know that he didn't like them. But so in the fall of 46, old Yogi disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. I never could find out. I always thought that he had a habit of lying out in the road in front of the dispatch office or someplace in the motor pool. And a truck came around the corner and killed him. And they didn't want to say anything to Lieutenant Hobler, who was their superior, or they might get in trouble. So I don't know what happened.
Are you still a second lieutenant here, or have you been promoted?
No,
to
I
first
was
lieutenant now?
promoted. I was promoted down at Benning in the summer of 45.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was supposed to get promoted when I left Deming in October 44. And I remember going into Lieutenant Colonel, who was my chief oversaw the section I was in. And he said, I just get ready to promote you to first lieutenant. And I said, well, Colonel, I said, I'd rather leave Deming and get out of here than be first lieutenant. He says, I know what you mean. Well, anyhow. No, I got promoted first lieutenant in the summer of 45. And so I was a battalion motor officer, and for the parachute field artillery, the 674, and mainly just to keep the vehicles running, 2.5, 3/4 Jeeps. We had a couple weasels that were used, from ship to shore operations, and they had treads on them. You'd go on land too. We used them mainly when the colonel wanted to go duck hunting. Our colonel was Harrison B. Harden, class of 35, West Pointer. He always let us know that because in meetings, I was a battalion motor officer.
Knock his ring.
That's right. He'd be over here, and
The
there's
ring
all
knocker,
these
yeah.
other here. He'd take the ring off. He'd look at it. This is UT ring. See? Maybe that's why old Hobler's got this ring. No, I like it. I got this when I graduated from UT in 64. And so old Harden would take off that ring, look at it, and rub it on his sleeves, and that's... But he was a good soldier. And...
So you were there in Jamachi till 47?
Right, until... I say...
Did you have any Japanese friends and all?
Oh, yes, you asked me that question. I'll get back to that.
Did you socialize with some?
No.
No, you never socialized?
was the battalion motor officer of the 674 from the 12th of April, 46 to April of 47. And then I went to the jump school, 11th Airborne, and I'll get that in a minute. No, I didn't. The only socialization I had, besides being the motor officer, I was also the labor officer. You know, you always have all these. You're the mess officer, you're the payroll officer, you're this and this and that. And so I was responsible for the Japanese labor. And so the Japanese labor would come on the post there at Jimachi, and they'd be down at the main gate, and there'd be maybe 8 to 12 signs along there in Japanese and in English. And so if Japanese were supposed to go to work at the battery or at the motor pool or at the headquarters, they were all farmed out. They would go to that point. And then a soldier would come down there and pick them up. And so this got a little ridiculous because we had more Japanese working than we had soldiers on the base. Well, anyhow, one day Colonel Hardin came to work early before the soldiers went down there to pick up the troopers, or pick up the Japanese laborers. And he came up there to me, he said, "Hobler, who are all those Japanese down there?" I said, "Well, Colonel, those are the people that work on the base, you know, over here at the motor pool, all the batteries, A, B, C, and headquarters." And, oh, he got mad. And well, what he found out was that some of the soldiers, every one of them had an orderly. The soldiers weren't doing anything. I mean, the little bat boy, the Japanese, was shining their shoes, cleaning their rifles. They had it made. And one time, when we had a fight over VD, you know, gonorrhea, fighting gonorrhea and syphilis, they had one of them walking around one of the batteries with a sandwich sign telling about the VD rate in that battery, how bad it was. That's what I loved about the Army. There's always a bunch of laughs, you know. And so we laughed now, but it's kind of serious then. But he got mad. He said, "I want you to get down there and I want you to do this. You reduce those down a certain percentage." And so what I ended up was going over to our base lab or labor officer, you know, or office, and working with the Japanese interpreter and reducing the number down. And we had interpreters, which we got along real well. One was a very pretty Japanese girl who spoke perfect English and Japanese. And I don't remember whether she was a Nisi or not, you know, second generation, or first generation, whatever. And the only other association I had with them was when I left Jimachi in April of 47, right. I went down to Yamato. That was where the 11th Airborne had their jump school.
Yes.
And
where's that?
That's right. Yeah. Right. About 30 minutes by train from Sendai. There's a bay there.
Okay.
And so I went down there, and when I first went down there, I was the provost marshal of the post, which was a little old Army, Air Force, and an Army Air Corps post. They had C-47, C-46s there for the paratroopers, you know.
Right.
And whenever we did any pay jumps, that's where people went to do they'd get on the plane there and then fly over maybe to the drop zone outside Sendai and jump there. And you had to jump once every 3 months to draw pay.
Keep your pay.
But we didn't jump for about a year because they didn't have enough planes. But we still drew that good old jump pay. Well, and then I ended up being the post exchange officer there. And so while I was in the provost marshal, we had a couple interpreters. Jimmy, which was an interesting sideline. He didn't look like a Japanese. He looked like Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And then had Frank, who was another interpreter. To jump ahead a little bit, years later, when I was in Italy, at Trieste, Italy, and the Korean War started, we started to get in these combat films, and we're using them in training. And one day I'm sitting here looking at the screen about troops. I guess they were the 7th Division. They were at a crossroad, and they were all standing around this one Oriental. Who was the Oriental? Jimmy. And I'll tell you why he was picked to go there. When I knew Jimmy, he was Japanese, but he had spent many years in Korea while the Japanese were there, see? So he knew Korean besides Japanese.
Korean, Japanese, and English.
Right. And the reason he got there is the only way I could see it. When I left there, he was in the Provost Marshal's office as an interpreter there at Yamato.
The 11th.
Yamato.
Yeah, Yamato.
At the jump school. Well, in 1949, the 11th Airborne rotated home to Fort Campbell. The 7th Division, which had been in Korea, along with the 6th Division on occupation duty, they rotated over and took the 11th Airborne's place there in Japan. So then when the Korean War started, and MacArthur did his famous run around in at Incheon, they took Jimmy along because he could speak in Korean. And then I also had some relationship in the PX. I had a Japanese man and wife. He was Japanese. She had been born in Hawaii and came to Japan and married him and got trapped there by the war. And so they ended up as the Japanese managers. And then all the girls in the PX worked there were Japanese. And a sweet bunch of people. And you'd be sitting in your office at the PX, and they would start singing. And they were scattered all over the PX. It was just one big old room, but it was quite large. And it was a pretty sound of hearing those Japanese girls singing.
So you went from Yamato to
Ohio. I left there. I left in I got out of the Army and went home.
Oh, you got out of the Army?
Yeah. But that's when I got out for 6 weeks. And then I went back.
From Yamato. You went from Yamato?
Yeah, by boat to... Well, I went by train from Yamato to Yokohama, and then a 14-day trip back to Fort Lawton. Right.
Back at Seattle.
Back to Seattle. And I got discharged there, and I flew home to Ohio. And
flew home?
Yeah, flew home.
Was that right?
It was 48, but this time they had started to, you could get, air flights.
Some kind of military flight?
No,
or just a commercial?
This commercial.
Went out, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And so then I decided to go back in the Army, but not as an officer. I went back as a master sergeant. They had a regulation was if you'd been an officer, you could re-enlist as a master sergeant. And so I was a master sergeant, and with a permanent warrant. I got it back there. They didn't. A lot of them had temporary warrants, but old Hobler could always brag he had a permanent warrant as a master sergeant.
Permanent warrant?
Yeah. It's like a diploma.
As a master sergeant?
Yeah. And
so this is just still 1947.
No, this is 48. See?
I thought it was just 6
No,
months.
from April of 47 till April of 48, I was at Yamato.
Okay, then you went back.
And then I went back to the States by boat and then by airplane into good old Columbus, Ohio. Hello, 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 Columbus, Ohio.